The sky above Zevaris Prime was a sea of silver, shimmering under the glow of its twin moons. The air hummed with an eerie stillness, the kind that settled before an inevitable storm. Elara Vaughn stood rigid in the grand hall of the High Council, her hands clenched at her sides, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. The circular chamber loomed around her, towering pillars of obsidian stretching toward the ceiling, like ancient fingers grasping at the heavens. She had stood here many times before, but never like this. Never as a prisoner. A row of elders sat before her, their faces impassive, untouched by the weight of what they were about to do. Their luminous silver eyes reflected nothing. Not anger, not regret, only judgment. "You have defied the natural order," the central elder spoke, his voice echoing through the chamber. Elara didn't flinch. She had expected this, had known this moment was coming long before they uttered the words. It had been written in the way they looked at her, in the whispers that followed her through the corridors of the capital, in the quiet, sharp edge of isolation that had wrapped around her like an iron shroud since the day her bondmate died. But she hadn't died with him. She was supposed to. That was the way of the Zevaris. A sacred bond, a perfect connection. When one half of the pair perished, the other followed. It had always been so. It was not questioned. It was nature, they said. It was how love worked. Only it wasn't. Because Elara still stood, breathing, thinking, defying. "Do you understand what you have done?" Another elder asked, his tone smooth, patient, as if she were a child in need of correction. Elara lifted her chin. "I survived." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some looked away, as if merely witnessing her existence was enough to taint them. "You have disrupted the balance," the first elder continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your continued existence challenges the foundation of our society. It is a corruption of the bond, an aberration that cannot be allowed to persist." Her hands tightened into fists. "You speak as though I chose this." "You are an anomaly," the elder stated. "One that must be corrected." Elara had expected condemnation. What she hadn't expected was what came next. "Exile," the elder pronounced. Her breath caught. Not execution. Not immediate death. They weren't simply punishing her. They were erasing her. She would be cast out, stripped of her name, her identity, her very existence in the eyes of the Zevaris. No one would speak of her again. She would become a ghost, a warning to others who might dare to question the natural order. Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded as she spoke the only words that mattered. "And my son?" The elders exchanged a look. She already knew the answer before they spoke it. "His fate is yours to bear." Her throat tightened. Asher was only 4. He had done nothing. He didn't understand why people whispered when he walked past, why mothers pulled their children away from him in the communal gardens, why no one looked at him the way they once had. He only knew that something had changed, that his mother was different, and because of that, so was he. They wouldn't spare him. Alara's nails dug into her palms. She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream at them, tell them how wrong they were, how blind. But she knew it would do nothing. The council's word was law, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. "You will be sent to Neuralis 9, the elder declared, the finality in his tone like a closing door. A frozen wasteland. No resources, no shelter. A place where only exiles and the condemned were cast, left to be swallowed by the cold. Not a death sentence, but something worse. A slow, inevitable end." The guards moved forward, their footsteps precise, methodical. Elara didn't fight as they seized her arms, even as every fiber of her being screamed to resist. It was useless. The outcome had already been decided. Her gaze swept across the chamber one last time. She saw no sympathy, no doubt, only relief. Relief that she would be gone. They led her through the corridors of the capital, past towering spires and bridges of seamless glass. She had once walked these paths as one of them. A soldier, a leader, a respected citizen. Now she was little more than a ghost. The whispers followed her, but no one met her gaze. It was as though she had already ceased to exist. The transport bay was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the world she was leaving behind. A sleek black shuttle waited on the platform, its engines humming softly. A one-way trip. They gave her only what she could carry. A ration pack, a thin thermal blanket, a ceremonial knife that was more for show than use, and a single fire starter. It was barely enough to survive a day. The doors opened, revealing the vast emptiness of the shuttle's interior. A small, trembling form was already inside. "Asher!" she breathed. The guards shoved her forward, but she barely noticed. She fell to her knees, pulling her son into her arms. He clung to her, his small fingers twisting into the fabric of her tunic. "I don't want to go," he whispered. Her throat ached, but she smoothed his dark curls, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I know, little one." He pulled back slightly, his violet eyes searching hers. "Are we coming back?" She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "No," she admitted. His lower lip quivered, but he nodded, trusting her even when the world had betrayed them both. The doors sealed shut behind them. A faint tremor ran through the ship as the engines roared to life. Elara didn't look back. The stars blurred into streaks of light as the ship launched into the abyss, carrying them away from the only home they had ever known. She held Asher close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The only certainty was this. They had been cast into the dark, and somehow she had to find a way to bring them back into the light. The cold was relentless. It seeped into every crevice, into every breath, coiling around Elara like an unshakable predator. The moment the shuttle doors had opened, the icy winds of Neuralis 9 had surged in, biting into her skin, stealing the warmth from her body with terrifying speed. The air itself felt sharp, each inhale burning her lungs, each exhale curling into fragile mist before vanishing into the frozen abyss. The sky was a vast expanse of nothingness, a dull shade of gray that blended with the endless wasteland of ice stretching before her. No shelter, no signs of life, just an unbroken void of white and shadow. She clutched Asher tighter, shielding him as best she could with her body. He was trembling, his small frame curled against her chest, his breath shallow. The thin thermal blanket they had given her was barely enough to fend off the cold, and the meager warmth from their shared body heat was vanishing faster than she could replace it. Every instinct in her screamed to move, to find cover, to find something, anything that could keep them alive. But there was nowhere to go. With stiff fingers, she pulled the ration pack from the bundle they had given her. Inside were small, dense nutrient bars, enough to last 2 days if rationed carefully. The knowledge settled like a stone in her stomach. 2 days. And then what? She had no way of knowing if there was even a path to survival on this planet. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this was never meant to be exile, but a delayed execution. She forced those thoughts away. Thinking like that wouldn't save them. "Asher," she murmured, brushing her frozen fingers against his cheek. "You have to eat." His violet eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He was already too cold. That terrified her more than anything. She broke off a piece of the nutrient bar and pressed it to his lips. At first, he didn't respond. She nearly panicked, shaking him gently until he blinked and took a slow, weak bite. Relief crashed into her like a wave, but it was fleeting. He was still too quiet, too still. She needed to get him warm. She looked around, scanning the landscape through the blur of wind and ice. The ground beneath them was a solid sheet of frost, offering no protection from the cutting winds. Her own body ached from the cold, her limbs sluggish, her thoughts thickening as the temperature continued to sap her strength. If they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't survive the night. There was nothing. No natural formations, no outcroppings, no caves. The Zevaris had chosen their place of exile well. A gust of wind howled past, nearly knocking her off balance. She gritted her teeth, repositioning Asher in her arms, holding him tighter. The fabric of her tunic was stiff with ice, already failing against the bitter elements. She had to do something. Her hands shook as she pulled the small fire starter from the bundle they had given her. It was a simple device, little more than a disposable igniter with barely enough charge for a few uses. If she could just get a fire going, even a weak one, it might be enough to push back the worst of the cold. She crouched down, angling herself to block the wind as best she could. With numb fingers, she dug into the snow-covered ice, scraping together what little debris she could find. Thin, brittle strands of dead vegetation buried beneath the frost. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The fire starter flickered to life, and for one agonizing moment, she thought the flame would die instantly. Then the dried plant fibers caught, glowing weakly before a small, fragile flame took hold. She exhaled, half in relief, half in desperation. Asher stirred against her, his tiny hands reaching toward the warmth. But the fire was pitifully small, struggling against the wind, threatening to die at any moment. She had to feed it. Her gaze flickered to her clothing, thin fabric, meant for the climate-controlled halls of Zevaris Prime. Not the brutal, unyielding cold of Neuralis 9. It wouldn't protect her for much longer anyway. And fire meant warmth. Fire meant survival. Gritting her teeth, she pulled the ceremonial knife from her belt, its ornate handle cold against her fingers. She slid the blade under the hem of her tunic, slicing away strips of fabric, wincing as the frigid air bit into her newly exposed skin. The moment she fed the strips to the fire, the flames surged, greedily devouring the offering, burning just a little brighter. She didn't hesitate. She kept cutting. The fire crackled, spreading its meager warmth, enough to bring a hint of color back to Asher's face. He curled closer to her, pressing against the heat, his small body trembling. She wrapped her arms around him, whispering softly, soothing him as best she could. "It's okay," she lied. "We're warm now." But she knew the truth. This fire wouldn't last long, and when it died, there would be nothing left. Her fingers ached from the cold, the skin turning a pale, unnatural shade. She had nothing else to burn unless she took off more of her clothing. Her teeth chattered violently, her body screaming for warmth, for shelter, for something she could not give it. She tried to think, tried to focus, but exhaustion was creeping in, the weight of it dragging at her limbs, dulling her senses. The fire flickered, barely holding on against the relentless wind. A shadow moved beyond the flames. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. Exhaustion and cold-weaving illusions. But then she saw it again. Something tall, moving against the swirling snow. Her breath hitched. Fear surged through her veins, sharp and immediate. A beast? Number. It moved with too much purpose. A raider. Unlikely. There was nothing of value here. A Zevaris enforcer, come to finish what the Council had started. Her muscles tensed, instinct screaming at her to move, to grab Asher and run. But there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped closer, just enough for the firelight to catch the gleam of thick furs, the outline of heavy boots crunching through the ice. A human. She recoiled automatically, pulling Asher closer, shielding him with her body. Humans were dangerous. That was what she had always been taught. They were violent, unpredictable, incapable of restraint. And yet, this one had not attacked. He stood a few feet away, watching her through the storm, his breath misting in the freezing air. He was enormous, his broad frame wrapped in thick layers of fur, built for survival in a place like this. Slowly, he reached up and unfastened his coat. Elara tensed. A weapon? A hidden blade? But instead of attacking, he pulled the heavy fabric from his shoulders and extended it toward her. She flinched, her mind racing through the possibilities, the risks. Accepting help from a human was unthinkable. But the fire was dying, and her son was slipping away. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, brushing against the warmth of the coat. Their hands met, just for an instant, and a strange heat lingered on her skin. Something beyond physical, something unfamiliar. She quickly wrapped the coat around Asher, pulling him close, feeling the warmth seep into his frozen limbs. The human watched her for a long moment, then crouched near the fire, his sharp eyes scanning her stripped-down tunic, the remains of fabric in the flames. "You burned your clothes to keep him warm." His voice was deep, rough, but not unkind. She didn't answer. She couldn't. He exhaled, his breath misting in the cold. "You'll die like this." She already knew that. But when he spoke again, there was something else in his voice. Something that made her pulse quicken with unease. "You have two choices," he said. "Stay here and freeze." The fire crackled between them, a dying heartbeat in the vast silence. "Or, come with me." The wind howled through the frozen wasteland, whipping through the tattered remains of Elara's tunic, biting deep into her exposed skin. The fire had burned low, little more than embers now, offering barely enough warmth to keep Asher from slipping further into the grasp of the cold. The human crouched nearby, watching her with a sharp, assessing gaze, his breath a steady plume of mist in the freezing air. His presence was a threat, a danger she couldn't afford to ignore. Elara's body ached from exhaustion, but she forced herself to stay tense, ready to strike if necessary. He was massive, towering over her even from his crouched position. Broad shoulders wrapped in thick furs, a heavy pack slung across his back, boots built for survival in terrain like this. Everything about him spoke of endurance, of strength honed by experience. He didn't move like a desperate scavenger or a reckless raider. He moved with precision, with control. That made him even more dangerous. Asher stirred against her chest, his small hands gripping the coat the human had given them. The gesture had been unexpected, and that unsettled her more than anything. A human offering aid without demand, without violence. It went against everything she had been taught. Humans were chaotic, unpredictable, driven by self-interest. She had no reason to trust him. But she had even less reason to trust the cold. She shifted slightly, keeping Asher shielded beneath the heavy coat, her mind racing through possible escape routes, ways to regain control. If she could get to his pack, there had to be food, supplies, something she could use. He had a knife strapped to his thigh, partially hidden beneath the folds of his coat, a weapon within reach if she moved fast enough. Her fingers curled around the ceremonial blade at her waist. It was small, not made for real combat, but it was all she had. The fire crackled weakly between them, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. She moved. Launching forward in a single fluid motion, she grabbed for his pack with one hand, while slashing toward him with the other. It should have worked. He should have been caught off guard, weighed down by the layers of thick clothing, by the complacency of offering kindness. But he wasn't. Faster than she thought possible, he twisted, his arm snapping up to block her strike. Her knife barely grazed the heavy fabric of his sleeve before his hand closed around her wrist, gripping it with an unyielding force. He didn't hurt her, didn't squeeze hard enough to break bone, but it was enough to halt her entirely. She struggled, twisting, trying to yank free, but he was stronger. His voice was low, steady. "That was stupid." She bared her teeth, still fighting against his grip. "Let go." He did, releasing her abruptly, and she staggered back a step, heart hammering against her ribs. He didn't retaliate, didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he simply adjusted his sleeve, as if she had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Her breath came in sharp bursts, a mixture of adrenaline and fury heating her blood. She had expected retaliation, had braced for the violence she had always been told humans resorted to. But he had barely reacted at all. Asher whimpered against her chest, pressing closer to the warmth of the coat, his tiny body trembling. Elara's grip on her blade tightened before she slowly, reluctantly, lowered it. The human watched her for a moment longer, then exhaled through his nose, as if he had already grown tired of her attempts. "You're starving," he said, his tone almost bored. "Your fire won't last the night. And that kid—" His gaze flicked to Asher. "He's barely hanging on." Elara bristled. "I can take care of my son." He raised an eyebrow. "Sure. That's why you're out here, half dead, trying to stab the only person offering you a chance to survive. She clenched her jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. He sighed, rubbing a gloved hand over his face, then finally shook his head. I don't need another body frozen in the snow. If you want to live, follow me. He stood, adjusting the straps on his pack, then turned, walking away without waiting for a response. Elara stayed frozen, gripping her knife even as she watched him move deeper into the storm. He didn't look back. He didn't demand anything. He had just left. She didn't understand. Everything about this was wrong. This wasn't how humans acted. He should have threatened her, should have tried to take what little she had left. That was how it worked. Asher made a small, miserable sound, barely more than a breath against her shoulder. Her throat tightened. She hated this. Hated that she was weak enough to even consider following a human. Hated that she had no other choice. She had always been strong. Even before exile, before her life had shattered, she had been trained to fight, to survive. She had once led squadrons, had stood at the right hand of commanders. She had never relied on anyone. And now she was stripped down to nothing, barely holding on to the most important thing in her life. Asher. His tiny hands clutched at the fabric of the coat, his breathing shallow. His body was still too cold. He needed warmth, shelter, food. She could barely give him one of those things, let alone all three. Pride wouldn't keep him alive. She closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them, forcing herself to move. Every step was an act of reluctant surrender, not to the human, but to the reality of their situation. She adjusted Asher in her arms and stepped forward, her body screaming in protest. The cold had settled into her bones, making every movement sluggish, painful. The fire sputtered behind her, the last embers barely clinging to life, and she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. The human was already a few yards ahead, his silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. She quickened her pace, catching up just enough to keep him within reach, but still keeping her distance. She didn't trust him. She might never trust him. But for now, she would follow. Not because she believed in his offer, not because she thought humans were capable of kindness, but because Asher needed to live. And she would do anything to make sure that happened. The shelter was little more than a half-collapsed structure of rusted metal and cracked glass, remnants of a research outpost long abandoned to the merciless elements of Neuralis 9. The walls groaned against the wind, but it was the closest thing to safety Elara had seen since her exile. Damien moved through the space with practiced ease, shaking the snow from his coat before setting his pack down near what remained of an old workstation. He barely spared her a glance as he rummaged through his supplies, pulling out nutrient bars and a flask of water. Without a word, he tossed one of the bars toward her. She caught it reflexively, eyes narrowing. "You should eat," he said, already biting into his own ration. Elara hesitated, studying the food in her hand. Trusting him was out of the question. But hunger clawed at her insides, and Asher, she glanced down at her son, curled weakly against her chest, needed strength more than she needed pride. Slowly, she broke off a piece and pressed it to his lips. He stirred, barely awake, but accepted it, chewing sluggishly. Only after he had swallowed did she take a cautious bite herself. The silence between them stretched. Damien seemed content to let it remain that way, focused on building a small fire in the center of the room. Elara's gaze flickered to his weapons, the knife at his belt, the rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. If she wanted to take control of this situation, she needed to be patient, to wait for the right moment. But Damien was no fool. "I know what you're thinking," he muttered without looking at her. Elara stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." He smirked, tossing another piece of kindling into the fire. "Sure I do. You're waiting for me to let my guard down, looking for a way out, maybe even thinking about trying to kill me in my sleep." He finally turned his sharp, assessing gaze on her. "Not gonna happen." Elara forced herself to hold his stare. "I don't trust you." "You don't have to," Damien said, unbothered. "But if you're smart, you'll at least pretend to." He had a point. She hated that he had a point. She adjusted Asher in her arms, the slow rise and fall of his breathing a small comfort. The heat from the fire was helping, but not enough. He was still too cold. His tiny body still too weak. Asher worsened the next day. The fever came without warning, creeping into his small frame like a shadow Elara couldn't fight. He shivered violently, his breathing turning shallow, his skin too hot to the touch. Panic curled around her throat like a vice. She had nothing to treat him with. No medicine, no proper shelter, no way to keep his fragile body from being consumed by the sickness. She pressed cool hands against his forehead, whispering soft reassurances even as fear gnawed at the edges of her mind. She had survived so much, endured exile, the cold, starvation. But this? Watching her son slip away, powerless to stop it. It was unbearable. She didn't hear Damien approach until he was kneeling beside them, pressing something into her hands. A small vial. She stared at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Something that'll help," he said simply. "It won't cure him, but it'll break the fever." Her grip tightened around the vial. "Why would you help us?" Damien exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. For the first time, his usual indifference flickered, revealing something deeper, something unspoken. "Because I've seen this before," he admitted, voice lower than usual. "And I know what happens if you don't do something." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Elara didn't thank him. She didn't know how to. But as she pressed the medicine to Asher's lips and watched the tremors in his small body ease, she realized something unsettling. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't fighting alone. Days passed. Asher's fever faded, and the uneasy truce between her and Damien began to shift into something neither of them spoke about. She still didn't trust him. But she no longer watched him with the same sharp-edged suspicion. He gave her space. He never demanded anything from her. And though she hated to admit it, she was grateful. The night she burned her last scrap of extra clothing, she thought she was alone. The fire had burned low, and Asher had curled into her side, his tiny hands still gripping the human's oversized coat. The cold pressed in, relentless, merciless, and she knew she couldn't let the fire die. So she cut another strip from her tunic, feeding it to the flames, watching the embers devour it hungrily. A quiet shift in the air made her glance up. Damien stood across from her, leaning against the far wall, watching. She tensed. "What?" He said nothing. Just shrugged off his heavy outer coat and crossed the small space between them. Before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders, his movements calm, deliberate. Elara froze. The coat was warm, thick with residual heat from his body. It smelled like smoke and leather, and something else she couldn't name. She should have shoved it back at him, should have refused. But the warmth seeped into her frozen skin, and exhaustion weighed too heavily on her bones. For the first time since her exile, she let herself lean into the warmth, just for a moment. Damien's hand brushed against hers as he adjusted the coat, a fleeting touch that sent something unfamiliar twisting in her chest. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't see the human she had been taught to fear. She just saw a man. And that, more than anything, terrified her. The air inside the shelter was thick with the scent of burning wood and melted snow, the low crackle of the fire the only sound breaking the silence. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving behind a suffocating stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that signaled something was coming. Elara sensed it first. A shift in the air, a feeling crawling along the back of her neck. Instinct, honed through years of training, whispered a warning through her bones. She tightened her grip around Asher, his small body curled against her side, his breath steady against her chest. He was still sleeping, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the walls. Then, Damien moved. He had been sitting near the fire, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes, but now his movements stilled. His head tilted slightly, listening, and in that instant, she knew he felt it too. They weren't alone. She barely had time to react before the first impact hit. The walls of the shelter shuddered violently, dust and debris raining from the cracked ceiling as a low mechanical hum filled the air. A ship, small, sleek, and unmistakably Zevaris in design. The executors had found her. She sprang to her feet, heart pounding as adrenaline surged through her veins. There was no point in running. They had come to finish what the Council had started. Damien was already moving, shoving his pack over his shoulder and grabbing his rifle in one fluid motion. His expression was unreadable, but there was no hesitation in the way he moved. He had expected this. "How many?" he asked, his voice quiet, steady. Elara swallowed hard, forcing herself to push down the fear clawing at her throat. "At least 3, she said. "Maybe more." His jaw tightened. Perfect. The door of the shelter exploded inward. The force of the blast sent shards of metal flying across the room. Elara barely had time to shield Asher before the shockwave knocked her backward. The fire flickered, then died as cold air rushed in, carrying with it the towering figures of the executors. They moved with eerie precision, stepping through the smoke without a sound, their cloaks billowing in the artificial wind from their ship. Their silver eyes, cold and emotionless, locked onto her immediately. The lead executor stepped forward, tall and unyielding, his presence radiating authority. "You were never meant to survive," he said. His voice was calm, almost detached. "And yet, here you are." Elara positioned herself in front of Asher, body tense, muscles coiled. "I won't let you take him." The executor barely spared a glance at the boy. "He is irrelevant." His gaze flicked back to her. "You, however, are a problem that must be corrected." Damien moved before she did. His rifle came up in a blink, the first shot ringing through the space like a thunderclap. One of the executors staggered back, but the energy shield embedded in their armor absorbed the impact. They turned in unison, shifting their focus toward him. He had their attention now. Elara didn't waste the opportunity. She lunged forward, drawing the blade from her belt, aiming for the soft gap between the executor's armor plates. But they were faster than she remembered. The one closest to her sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing her wrist mid-strike and twisting hard. Pain flared up her arm and she gasped, barely managing to keep her grip on the knife. Damien fired again. This time, he didn't aim for the armor. He aimed for the exposed joints. The second executor collapsed as the bullet tore through the vulnerable point at his knee. But before Damien could take another shot, the leader moved. A pulse of energy erupted from his palm, striking Damien square in the chest. He hit the ground hard, sliding across the icy floor, his rifle clattering out of reach. Elara barely had time to process the surge of panic before the executor turned back to her. "Your survival was an anomaly," he said, almost regretfully. "One that ends now." She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. With a sharp inhale, she wrenched herself free, twisting her body to drive the blade upward. This time, she found flesh. The executor hissed, a flicker of something close to surprise crossing his usually impassive face. Then, everything exploded into motion. Damien was back on his feet, knife in one hand, sidearm in the other. He moved like a predator, fluid and ruthless. The remaining executor turned just in time to take a bullet to the throat. He crumpled instantly. Elara barely registered the sound of the body hitting the ground before the lead executor recovered, his movements impossibly fast. He struck out, palm open, and an invisible force slammed into her, sending her flying backward. She hit the wall with a sharp crack, her vision momentarily going white with pain. The executor advanced, raising his hand again, but before he could deliver the final blow, Damien was there. He tackled the executor from behind, driving his knife deep into the base of his neck. The executor jerked, body seizing, silver eyes widening in something almost like shock before going blank. The fight was over. Damien exhaled sharply, pulling the knife free and letting the body slump to the ground. He turned, chest heaving, eyes scanning for any remaining threats. Silence. Elara forced herself to sit up, ignoring the sharp ache radiating through her ribs. She pushed herself to her feet, moving toward Asher, who was still huddled against the wall, eyes wide with fear. She dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his small frame, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Damien leaned against the broken doorframe, wiping blood from his knife. "That was fun." She shot him a glare, but he only smirked, Then, the weight of what had just happened settled onto her shoulders. The executors were dead. The council would know. They wouldn't stop with just one attempt. This wasn't over. She looked at Damien. He was watching her, expression unreadable. But there was no doubt in his stance. He had chosen to fight for her, to protect Asher, even when he had no reason to. For the first time since exile, she wasn't running alone. She didn't say thank you. But she didn't have to. The moment Asher was ripped from her grasp, something inside Elara shattered. His terrified cry cut through the chaos, piercing deeper than any blade ever could. She lunged forward, but the executor holding him was already moving, retreating toward the open ramp of their sleek silver ship. The wind roared through the broken shelter, sending ice and debris swirling around them, but all she saw was Asher, his small body struggling in the iron grip of the enforcer, his violet eyes wide with fear. Her vision narrowed, everything else fading into the background. She had lost everything once. She had endured exile, starvation, and death hunting her at every turn. But she would not lose him. Not now. Not ever. Elara's pulse pounded, a deep, primal force surging through her veins, something she had spent a lifetime suppressing. The power within her, the gift of her Zevaris lineage, had always been kept under control, dulled by the teachings of her people, by the false belief that their bonds dictated their strength. But the bonds were a lie. The power had always been hers. And now she let it break free. A surge of energy exploded from within her, raw and unrestrained, sending a shockwave through the air. The executor holding Asher staggered, his footing slipping on the ice as an invisible force slammed into him. His grip loosened just enough. It was all she needed. She moved with lethal precision, closing the distance between them in a blink. Her fingers curled around the hilt of her blade, and with a swift, merciless strike, she drove it into the gap between his armor plates. The executor gasped, silver eyes widening in shock before he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Asher tumbled from his arms, and Elara caught him, pulling him close against her chest. His tiny hands clutched at her tunic, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She whispered to him, pressing a trembling kiss to his forehead. But there was no time for comfort. More were coming. Behind her, Damien fought with brutal efficiency, but he was outnumbered. Blood dripped from a gash along his ribs, soaking through the fabric of his coat. But he didn't falter. He moved with a soldier's instinct, ducking low to avoid a strike before driving his blade into his attacker's throat. Another came at him from the side, and he fired his sidearm point blank, sending the body crashing to the ice. But he wasn't fast enough to avoid the next blow. A pulse of energy slammed into him, knocking him backward with bone-crushing force. He hit the ground hard, sliding across the frozen terrain. He didn't move. Elara's breath caught, fear gripping her heart in a way she had never known. "Damien!" He didn't respond. The last remaining figure stepped forward, his presence an undeniable weight pressing down on the space between them. The executor leader. Unlike the others, he had not engaged in combat. He had simply watched, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Now, he moved with deliberate control, as if the outcome had never been in question. Elara's grip tightened around Asher. She could still feel the energy humming beneath her skin, the raw power she had unleashed, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The executor leader stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as he regarded her. "You were never meant to live past the bond," he said, voice smooth, unshaken. "Yet here you stand." Elara lifted her chin, forcing steel into her voice. "You fear me. That's why you came." He gave the smallest smile. "Number, I came to erase an error." He moved fast, faster than she expected. But this time, she was faster. She met his attack head-on, their blades clashing in a spray of sparks. He was strong, but she was fueled by something deeper. Rage, desperation, the unwavering certainty that she would never let them take Asher from her again. She fought with everything she had, every movement precise, every strike aimed to kill. He parried her blows with expert skill, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of surprise beneath his cold exterior. She wasn't supposed to be this strong. She wasn't supposed to win. And yet, she did. With a final, brutal strike, She drove her blade deep into his chest, piercing through the heart of everything her people had forced her to believe. The light in his silver eyes flickered, then faded. He fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Elara stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking, staring down at the body of the man who had sentenced her to death. It was over. The ship remained where it had landed. The other executors either dead or gone. They had failed. She turned, rushing to Damien's side. He was still alive, barely, his breath uneven, his skin too pale from blood loss. She pressed a hand against his wound, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hold on. Do you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. His lips quirked into a weak smirk. "Did we win?" A shaky laugh escaped her. "Yeah, we won." And for the first time since exile, she truly believed it. The fire crackled softly in the remains of the shelter, its golden glow casting flickering shadows against the walls. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost fragile after the chaos of the battle. The bodies of the executors had been buried beneath the ice, their ship abandoned, stripped of anything useful. The fight was over. They had won. But victory felt less like a celebration, and more like the beginning of something uncertain. Elara sat beside Damien, pressing a fresh bandage against the wound at his side. He had lost too much blood, but he was still breathing, still here. That was all that mattered. He winced slightly at her touch, and she pulled back, but his hand caught her wrist before she could move away. "I'm not that fragile," he murmured, his voice rough but teasing. She arched a brow. "You nearly died." "Nearly," he said, his lips twitching into something that resembled a smirk. "That's the key word." A reluctant smile ghosted across her face before she shook her head, focusing back on securing the bandage. "You're impossible. And yet, you keep patching me up." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Asher stirred beside them, his small fingers still curled into Damien's coat, the only real warmth he had known since they had arrived on this frozen wasteland. He had barely let go of it since the night Damien had first given it to him. Now, as his violet eyes fluttered open, still hazy with exhaustion, he blinked up at them both, taking in the quiet, the aftermath. His gaze landed on Damien, and for a long moment, he simply stared, as if measuring something in his tiny mind. Then, with the simple innocence only a child could possess, he spoke. "Dad?" The word was small, uncertain. Elara froze. She hadn't expected it, hadn't even thought about it. Damien stiffened too, his usual sharp wit momentarily stolen as he stared at the boy. Asher didn't seem to notice the weight of what he had just said. He simply shifted closer, tucking himself against Damien's side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Something inside Elara softened. She had spent her entire life believing love was something predetermined, something dictated by the biological bonds of her people. But here, in this moment, she understood the truth. Love wasn't fate. It wasn't a rule carved into her DNA. It was a choice, and she had already made hers. She reached out, her fingers brushing over Damien's, and this time, she didn't pull away. Elara's breath caught, fear gripping her heart in a way she had never known. "Damien!" He didn't respond. The last remaining figure stepped forward, his presence an undeniable weight pressing down on the space between them. The executor leader. Unlike the others, he had not engaged in combat. He had simply watched, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Now, he moved with deliberate control, as if the outcome had never been in question. Elara's grip tightened around Asher. She could still feel the energy humming beneath her skin, the raw power she had unleashed, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The executor leader stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as he regarded her. "You were never meant to live past the bond," he said, voice smooth, unshaken. "Yet here you stand." Elara lifted her chin, forcing steel into her voice. "You fear me. That's why you came." He gave the smallest smile. "Number I came to erase an error." He moved fast, faster than she expected. But this time, she was faster. She met his attack head-on, their blades clashing in a spray of sparks. He was strong, but she was fueled by something deeper. Rage, desperation, the unwavering certainty that she would never let them take Asher from her again. She fought with everything she had, every movement precise, every strike aimed to kill. He parried her blows with expert skill, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of surprise beneath his cold exterior. She wasn't supposed to be this strong. She wasn't supposed to win. And yet, she did. With a final, brutal strike, she drove her blade deep into his chest, piercing through the heart of everything her people had forced her to believe. The light in his silver eyes flickered, then faded. He fell. The silence that followed was deafening. Elara stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking, staring down at the body of the man who had sentenced her to death. It was over. The ship remained where it had landed. The other executors either dead or gone. They had failed. She turned, rushing to Damien's side. He was still alive, barely, his breath uneven, his skin too pale from blood loss. She pressed a hand against his wound, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hold on. Do you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. His lips quirked into a weak smirk. "Did we win?" A shaky laugh escaped her. "Yeah, we won." And for the first time since exile, she truly believed it. The fire crackled softly in the remains of the shelter, its golden glow casting flickering shadows against the walls. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost fragile after the chaos of the battle. The bodies of the executors had been buried beneath the ice, their ship abandoned, stripped of anything useful. The fight was over. They had won. But victory felt less like a celebration, and more like the beginning of something uncertain. Elara sat beside Damien, pressing a fresh bandage against the wound at his side. He had lost too much blood, but he was still breathing, still here. That was all that mattered. He winced slightly at her touch, and she pulled back, but his hand caught her wrist before she could move away. "I'm not that fragile," he murmured, his voice rough but teasing. She arched a brow. "You nearly died." "Nearly," he said, his lips twitching into something that resembled a smirk. "That's the key word." A reluctant smile ghosted across her face before she shook her head, focusing back on securing the bandage. "You're impossible. And yet, you keep patching me up." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Asher stirred beside them, his small fingers still curled into Damien's coat, the only real warmth he had known since they had arrived on this frozen wasteland. He had barely let go of it since the night Damien had first given it to him. Now, as his violet eyes fluttered open, still hazy with exhaustion, he blinked up at them both, taking in the quiet, the aftermath. His gaze landed on Damien, and for a long moment, he simply stared, as if measuring something in his tiny mind. Then, with the simple innocence only a child could possess, he spoke. "Dad?" The word was small, uncertain. Elara froze. She hadn't expected it, hadn't even thought about it. Damien stiffened too, his usual sharp wit momentarily stolen as he stared at the boy. Asher didn't seem to notice the weight of what he had just said. He simply shifted closer, tucking himself against Damien's side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Something inside Elara softened. She had spent her entire life believing love was something predetermined, something dictated by the biological bonds of her people. But here, in this moment, she understood the truth. Love wasn't fate. It wasn't a rule carved into her DNA. It was a choice, and she had already made hers. She reached out, her fingers brushing over Damien's, and this time, she didn't pull away. "Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.